Kia ora. Theme today is forgiveness, judgment and restoration. Let's begin with forgiveness. The first reading is the well-known parable of the soup stone. You can find it on the internet. It's a reminder that together we can not only feed and care for each other, but we can find the grace we need in order to flourish. It's a parable about the power of community togetherness. In the context of forgiveness, the soapstone parable invites the forgiven to participate again in the community, giving what they can. Forgiveness requires resolution, restitution, and reconstitution of the relationship between the offender and the offended against. And part of that process of restoration is community participation. But carefully, thoughtfully. You don't, for example, put the recovering alcoholic in charge of serving the wine, or the recovering thief in charge of the cash box, or the child abuser with children. So like the authentic Jesus saying in the next reading, forgive 70 times 7. Yes, we keep on forgiving and restoring, offering grace. But we do it wisely as a community, protecting the vulnerable and protecting the one who has offended. If it takes a village to raise a child, it also takes a village to restore that child who has grown into an adult. Unlike the soapstone parable with its warm affirmation of community, the second reading from Matthew 18:21 to 35 offers us a parable designed to make us feel uncomfortable and to make us question what is just, what is justice. Often titled the parable of the unforgiving slave or servant, is usually told as a cautionary tale. A king forgives a debtor a large amount, but the debtor in turn does not forgive a fellow debtor a smaller amount. The debtor's colleagues, upset by his actions, tell the king, and the king sends the unforgiving debtor off to be tortured. The lesson: forgive as you have been forgiven, or else. This is how Matthew, the editor-in-chief of this gospel, seems to understand the story. He gives his own personal interpretation in verse 35. So my heavenly Father will also do to everyone if you do not forgive. Matthew equates the king with God and tells us that God will torture us if we don't forgive. A torturing God. Jesus, like his Jewish audience, is not into a God or a king who tortures. It was people like Pilate, Roman overlords and their ilk, who did the torture thing. And despite the furnace fantasies of the Hellfire Brigade, the Christian church does not believe in a God who tortures. So we have a riddle here. Why include torture in this story? Let's start with the king. There are Jewish stories, parables that equate a king with God, but not in the New Testament. In this parable, it is only Matthew's editorial addition at the end, verse 35, which has that equation. Rather, in this parable, the king is equated with or symbolizes a way of doing justice. This parable is all about questioning that way of doing justice. Our first clue is the mismatch with Peter's question in verse 21. Peter asks, "How often should I forgive? 70 times 7, says Jesus. Hyperbolically meaning forever and ever. Yet in the parable, the king only forgives once, not forever and ever. The king, unlike Jesus and unlike Jesus' God, is not into repeated forgiveness and mercy. Our second clue is the grand scale revenue gathering. Imagine a super rich king, 10 times richer than any king you know. That's what the 10,000 talents of silver, verse 24, indicate. You see, King Herod's annual collection for the whole of Palestine was only 900 talents, not 10,000. The king then hands out the tax collecting job to the highest bidder, who, after adding on his percentage, subcontracts out the actual work to others. Imagine the amount of money that this highest bidder deals in. The parable's Jewish audience knew all the money and tax collecting talk meant only one thing: empire. A Roman Gentile empire, ruled, of course, by a Roman Gentile king. Our third clue is found in the way the king acts. When the highest bidder couldn't deliver on his promise, the king ordered him to be sold, along with his wife, kids, and possessions. From a Jewish perspective, this highlights Gentile cruelty, since Jewish law forbade the sale of wife and children to settle a husband's debts. From our perspective, it's further evidence that the king is a Gentile and is certainly not the Jewish God. Up to now, the audience is lapping all this up, poking fun at the high and mighty, the overlords and pagan Gentiles. It's great sport. They snigger when the highest bidder, the bloke we'll later call the Unforgiving Servant, fell on his knees before the king, saying, "He will repay, forgive me." No Jew would grovel like that. An audience loves to laugh at those who are different, loving stories that don't put them on the spot. The king's pitting of the servant, though, is unexpected. The audience says, "Huh? A Gentile king forgiving an underling? Forgiveness for failure? Whatever will come next?" The consistency of the audience's superiority to the Gentile characters is disturbed. But that consistency is not disturbed for long. The forgiven servant goes out and grabs one of his colleagues by the throat, demanding that he cough up the little he owes or else. The audience is back on safe ground. "Typical Gentile bully," they might have said to one another. "See how the pagans treat each other." In the story, off stage, the other tax collectors have seen all this. They've seen the king forgiving. They've seen this forgiven servant go and demand money from a fellow tax collector who couldn't pay, and then send that colleague to jail. These off-stage tax collectors are outraged. The story's audience joins in that feeling of outrage. Injustice has happened. He should have forgiven that man like the king forgave him. So the fellow tax collectors, and in spirit the audience, takes the unforgiving servant to the king. The king too shares in this feeling of outrage and injustice. Yet here at the finale of the story, the sympathy of the audience shifts. Instead of the usual Gentile punishment for debts, the servant is sent to suffer forever at the hands and sick minds of torturers. The harshness of this punishment disturbs the audience's sense of what is just. According to the parable scholar Brandon Scott, it wasn't though the torture that the audience likely found most disturbing. It was the king who changed his mind. Remember, the king originally forgave the debtor. His debt was cleared, but it obviously wasn't forgiven. When the debtor transgressed against a colleague, the king heard of it and uncleared the debt. When the first century Gentile king goes back on his word, when he takes back his forgiveness and reinstates the original debt, the ordered Hellenistic world threatens to fall apart. If the king can take back his forgiveness, who is safe? Justice requires a system that's perceived as fair, where there is cause and effect, and where the rules are consistent. So the theological question is not just whether the God of Jesus is into excessive punishment and torture. It is also whether the God of Jesus forgives but doesn't forget. A kind of 3 strikes legislation God. Got 3 chances and then you're toast. So this is a story that challenges us. It asks us whether we are prepared to take seriously the tasks of healing the wrongs in our community. Like for like justice, retributive justice, might satisfy our desire for vengeance, but it doesn't restore community well-being. It doesn't build participation. It doesn't build a safer world. We need our leaders to model wise compassion, so that by offering hope to offenders, hope is offered to us all. The story also challenges us regarding whose job justice is. It's tempting to want to leave justice to a judge, a king, or a god, and then criticize them when they don't do what we want. The transformation needed to build a just community involves us all. Tougher sentences and more and bigger prisons are signs of failure. Failure to listen, failure to initiate change and help one another. They are the failure of community. Forgiveness is not the 490 boxes, remember, 70 times 7, that an accountant God or an accountant church or an accountant society is keeping tally of, counting how many times we've screwed up and whether we're being really, truly remorseful. Forgiveness is a given in the Jesus world. Mercy is our language, our currency. The challenge, though, is how to heal the wounds. The wounds of the most vulnerable, the wounds of those who do the most wounding. In other words, the challenge is to foster, build, and restore community well-being. Blessings to you this week.